Basic Science class. My name is Ejiro Efere. Today we shall continue a lesson on the topic family traits. Part of what we shall be looking at in today's lesson are the importance of family traits. Remember, this lesson is gotten from the theme learning about our environment. By the end of today's class, you should be able to discuss the works of Gregor Mendel, identify some dominant and recessive traits in your family once again, and state the importance of family traits. Lastly, you should be able to trace your own family traits. In our last lesson, we were introduced to family traits. We said these traits are characteristics that are shared between the parents and the children of a family. We said these traits color, and we saw the recessive traits, which are traits that would always be hidden whenever they are paired with a dominant trait. And we said if you see any of these recessive traits in a person, it is because that person has two recessive alleles for that trait. For example, the blue eye color. We said it is possible that the person's mother contributed the blue eye color, which is recessive, and his father also contributed the blue eye color, which is another recessive. So two recessive alleles will come together to make a recessive gene, and that's why we can see the recessive trait in a person. We looked at how genes are inherited from parents to children. We said we have different numbers of cells in our bodies, and all of these cells contains genes, and it is these genes that carry the information that determines the traits of a person. And we said these genes are inherited from the parents when these children were being born. So I inherited my genes from my parents when I was born. So we inherit two copies of genes for each trait. For example, the color of eyes or color of the skin or so on. We always have two copies. We can see the color of somebody's hair, color of hair. We have the red color and the brown color. So for each trait, for each characteristics, you inherit two copies of genes. One from your mom and one from your dad. All of this knowledge, all of this information on how genes are inherited from parents to children was not well known, although people all over the world understood that genes are inherited or they were inherited from parents. People understood that they look the way they are because they inherited certain genes from their parents. But they do not even understand how these traits or how these genes were inherited. So in our last lesson, we learned about how these genes were inherited. But this knowledge was not known until someone came and made the discovery. So the knowledge of how genes are inherited from parents or how genes are passed on from one family generation to another came from the works of a scientist who is called Gregor Mendel. Can you pronounce that? That's the name of a person. He's a scientist, or he was a scientist. Gregor, that's the first name, and Mendel. So we have Gregor Mendel. You can call him Mendel for short. Gregor Mendel is popularly called the father of genetics. So whenever you hear the name Gregor Mendel, think of genetics. He's popularly called the father of genetics because he came about, or he brought out, or he brought about, or he discovered the knowledge of how genes are inherited from parents. And we said he discovered this in his works in genetics. So we have genetics, and he is called the father of genetics. Genetics here simply refers to the study of how traits are passed on from parents to their offspring. So genetics simply means the study or the science that deals with how traits are passed on from parents to children. And this discovery was made by Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel did several research as a scientist. As a scientist, he conducted several scientific experiments. So he did several experiments in the 1960s. He lived around the 1960s, and he tried several experiments to come up with these results. He did this experiment to find out how traits are inherited. He worked with pea plants. So most of his experiments on genetics were done on pea plants. We have the pea plant, the common pea plant, which we use to prepare vegetable rice, fried rice, and so on. This is the pea plant, and these are the seeds. So he performed most of his experiments on the pea plant. He noticed that some of the plants that were growing in his garden, growing around his house, then he had a garden within his house. He was a monk, so he was living in a monastery. But within the monastery, they had a garden where they grow plants for consumption. So among those plants were peas. Gregor Mendel noticed that some of these peas were displaying different kinds of characteristics, different kinds of traits. Some of them had flowers, beautiful flowers, or flowers with beautiful colors. They had seed pod with different colors and so on. Some of these peas were tall, some were short, and so on. He was amazed at the way these pea plants were displaying different characteristics. He was able to identify 7 of these characteristics. Remember, we said these characteristics are traits. So he identified 7 kinds of traits that were seen among the pea plants that grew in his garden. He looked at it. So different kinds of characteristics. These characteristics were the height of the stem. He noticed that some of the pea plants were tall, while some were short. The color of the flower. Some pea plants had white flower, while some had purple flower. So the garden was looking beautiful with purple and white colored flowers. He also noticed that the position of these flowers were different. Some pea plants had their flowers positioned at the edge of the branches, as you can see in this case, while some had their flowers positioned at the middle part of the branches, or at the junction of the branches. So he called those at the edge the terminal flowers, and those at the mid part axial or axial flowers. He also noticed that the shape of the pod, now the pod refers to this. Remember the pod of the bean plant and so on. So this is like the bean plant. The pod, or the shape of this pod, were also different for different pea plants. Some were smooth, as you can see. The shape of the pod, these smooth ones are also called full pod, while some were constricted, or they were wrinkled. They were not as smooth or as full as those other ones. He looked at the color of the pod as well. What color can you see from these pea plants? Green, right? These ones are also green. These are green. But Gregor Mendel noticed that some special kind of pea plant had the yellow pod. They had yellow pods, so they were different from those green ones. He saw the color of the seed coat. We can say the color of the seed coat, or he saw the shape of the seed. For some seed coats, some were yellow or some were green. He noticed in another plant that the shape of the seed, some were round and some were wrinkled. And lastly, Mendel observed the shape of the seed. We had the wrinkled seeds and the smooth or the round seeds. All of these 7 characteristics were present in his garden. They were found in the peas plant that grew in his garden. He observed some of these traits, how these traits were passed on from one generation to another. He noticed that a certain plant that might have purple flowers and wrinkled seed pod ended up producing offspring that had white flowers with smooth seed pod, or with smooth pod. He was confused. What is happening? How are these pea plants just taking up different characteristics? How will a pea plant with white flower end up producing an offspring with purple flower? He kept on observing until he came to a conclusion. But he didn't just come to a conclusion. After careful observation, he decided to carry out his experiment. One example of Mendel's experiment is seen in this case. At one point, he tried to do something. What did he do? he tried to cause two pea plants that had different heights. One was tall and the other was short. So he tried to cause these two pea plants to produce an offspring. Remember, plants are living things as well. So they also show different traits, different characteristics. They produce offspring, they reproduce. So he tried to cause these two pea plants, the short pea plant and the tall pea plant, to produce an offspring. How did he do this? He simply helped to pollinate this plant. Remember pollination? He said pollination is the transfer of stigma from the anther of a plant. Sorry, we said pollination is simply the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a plant to the stigma of a plant. So let's see how this happened. He did this by placing pollen grains. You can take a look at this pea plant. These are the flowers. Usually a mature flower will produce pollen grains, and the pollen grains will usually be found at the tip of the flower. When the flower had produced pollen grains, Gregor Mendel took these pollen grains from this tall pea plant. This is a tall pea plant now. Okay, let's take a look at it from this angle. He took the pollen grain from the tall pea plant, matured flower of a tall pea plant, and he brought it to the matured flower of the short pea plant, and he placed them on the stigma of these mature flowers in the short pea plant. So he took pollen grains from the flowers, the anther or the flowers of the pea plant, and he placed them on the stigma of the short one. Or we can say he took the pollen grains from the tall plant and placed them on the short one, or from the short plant and placed them on the tall one. However he did it, he caused pollination to occur. After that process, the flower of that plant was pollinated. In our case, we are using the short pea plant. So he pollinated the short pea plant. This is our short pea plant here. So he has just pollinated this flower. After pollinating, the flower will go on to produce seeds, and these seeds are usually enclosed in the pods. Pollination has to take place for seeds, or for plants to produce seeds, or for plants to produce fruit. So he just helped this plant to undergo pollination by placing pollen grains on the flower. After he did this, he waited for the flower to produce seeds and for these seeds to get to maturity, and he eventually harvested the seeds and went on to plant the seeds. So Gregor Mendel planted the seeds that were realized from that pollinated pea plant. After planting the seed, he discovered, or he realized, that all the plants, the peas that grew from those seeds, remember we said he took these seeds from this pollinated flower, he went on to plant them on a particular area of his garden, and he waited for those seeds to grow into new offspring, which are new pea plants. When they all grew, he realized that the pea plant that grew from those seeds were all tall. Remember, those seeds were gotten from a short parent and another tall parent. So we had a short pea plant and a tall pea plant. In this case, how many alleles do we have? 2 alleles for height, 2 alleles for everything. But for the case of height, we have the short allele and the tall allele. The short from the short plant, the tall from the tall plant. So all the offspring, all the plants that were grown from the seeds that was gotten from this pollinated plant were all tall. So he was confused. But I combined the grains from a tall plant and that of a short plant. Why are they all tall? Shouldn't some be short and some tall? He didn't understand what's happened. He waited for some time and he decided to pollinate these tall pea plants, the tall pea plants that were grown from those seeds. So he went on again. He took the pollen grains from this pea plant, which is tall in this case, and he went on to pollinate the flower of this other tall pea plant, all from those first parents. So he did this pollination process once again. The flower went on to produce seeds. He took the mature seeds and he planted them on another area, a different area in his garden. And he waited for these new sets of seed from the second pollinated flowers to grow. So this seed germinated, and when they germinated, they started growing. They grew to maturity, and Gregor Mendel realized that not all of these pea plants were tall. Some were tall and some were short. He was amazed. Oh, but all of these seeds were gotten from parents that were all tall. Of course, he took the pollen grain of a tall pea plant and he placed it on the flower of another tall pea plant. And this flower produced seeds. And when he planted the seed, he had 3 tall pea plants and a short one. He was confused the more. He said, what could have happened to these seeds? Why is it that they produced 3 tall plants and 1 short? So he sat down to look at how these genes were actually transferred from one generation of plants to the other. So this takes us back to our previous lesson when we looked at the recessive genes, recessive alleles, or recessive traits. In the case of Gregor Mendel's experience, he realized or he understood that this tall trait, the trait of tallness in this pea plant, where all of these pea plants were tall, he realized that that tall trait was the dominant trait. So the fact that all of those plants had tall trait or tall alleles in their genes, they all came out as tall plants. Let's take a look at what their genes would have looked like. This is a tall pea plant. So let's say it had capital letter T for tall and another capital letter T for tall. In this case, this tall plant doesn't have the recessive allele. It has dominant allele. Remember, we say dominant alleles are written in capital letters. Dominant allele, which is for tall plants, and another dominant allele for tall plant. These 2 alleles make up the gene of this plant for the character of tallness. In this case, this one is a short plant, so it will have the small letter T and the small letter T. It must have 2 recessive for it to be short. So let's take a look at how they contributed these genes to their offspring. The mother, or let's say this is the father. We can call father and mother in plants as well. So let's say this is the father, the short plant. It contributed the small letter, while the mother gave her small letter. So this plant will have capital letter T and small letter T. At the end, the dominant will be displayed, so this plant must be tall. It will contribute this other to this second offspring, and the mother will contribute her own second allele. This plant will also have capital letter T and small letter T. If you do that for all of these offspring, the third one will also have capital letter T and small letter T. If you do it for the 4th one as well, we'll have capital letter T and small letter T. At the end of the day, they all have dominant alleles in their gene, and we say the dominant allele must be displayed. So that was why all of these pea plants ended up being tall. What could have happened in the 2nd generation? Gregor Mendel also revealed to us what happened. These ones now had capital letter T, small letter T in 4 places. So this is capital letter T, small letter T, capital letter T, small letter T, and so on. All of them had this kind of genes for the characteristics of height. So by the time this one would have contributed capital letter T and small letter T to give offspring, you realize that if you keep crossing it, this one will give its capital letter T, and if you keep crossing, at one point, these 2 small letters will meet, and when you have 2 small letters, that's for short stem, you end up producing the short plant, whose original gene is like that of its grandparent. So Gregor Mendel revealed all of this science, all of this mechanism to us, and today we can boldly talk about genes and how they are inherited from parents to offspring. We can talk about recessive genes, and we can also talk about dominant genes because of the works of Gregor Mendel. So we can see that recessive genes, which are the hidden genes, which is the gene for shortness, was displayed in some of his pea plants because the dominant gene in those plants was, or they were absent. So in this case, in this short plant, there was no dominant gene. All this plant had was small letter T and small letter T, no dominant. Dominant will always be written in capital. So this plant ended up being short because it took the small or the recessive traits from the parents. So Gregor Mendel's work exposed us to the knowledge of how genes are passed on from parents to children. If you take a close look at our grandparents, your grandparents or your great-grandparents if you saw them, if they are still alive, or if your grandparents are still there, if you take a close look at our grandparents, look at your parents as well. You might also discover that some recessive traits are present in your family. Maybe they were hidden in the lives of your parents. Maybe they were hidden in your own siblings. Maybe you don't have this recessive trait, your siblings do not have them, but maybe sometime in the past, your grandparents or your great-grandparents had some of these recessive traits. So you may be able to discover some recessive traits that were hidden in the lives of, say, your parents or your grandparents, and they could not be displayed in the children. Or however, they were displayed in the children, recessive traits were displayed in the children, and they were not found in the parents of a family. We could also be able to identify some of those traits that might have skipped some generations. For example, in the case of this family, we said these two offspring or children of this couple might end up having children with red hair. If they have children with red hair, this simply means that red hair skipped their generation because they both have black hair color. So you can see that in some families, some genes or some traits might have skipped certain generation. Maybe it skipped the generation of your parents. Your parents didn't have it. Then when they gave birth to you and your siblings, you discover that you had some traits that were present in your grandparents or your great-grandparents, but your parents did not have them. The concept of recessive and dominant trait can also be seen in the case of two tall parents having short child or having a short child or short children. You can see tall parents. Sometimes you find short parents having a tall child, or you can see short parents or tall parents having a short child. However it is, sometimes you just see children who look different from their parents, and you might be wondering, where did they get these genes from? It might just be a recessive gene that skipped maybe the generation of his parents or of their parents. Why are we learning about traits? Why are they important? Should we learn about traits? Are they actually important to us? Have you learned something new? Yes, it is good we learn about traits. For example, I learned about traits and I understood why I became tall, why I grew tall. I also understood why the complexion of my skin is dark. If I see my grandparents, I will appreciate them the more because I understand that I took or I inherited genes from them. They passed on these genes to my parents, and my parents passed on these genes to I and my siblings. So the knowledge of one's family trait is important. It is important we learn about this family trait for various reasons. Some of the reasons are as follows. The knowledge of family traits will help us identify certain diseases that may be passed on from one generation to another in our families. Remember, we mentioned that some of the traits that are passed on from generation to generation in a family include some diseases and health conditions. Can you remember them? We mentioned conditions like obesity, sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. We also have hypertension and so on, color blindness. All of these conditions are likely to pass from parents to children. So if you learn about your family trait, you realize that my great-grandparents had this disease condition, and this kind of disease condition is likely to pass from generation to generation. Say, for example, hypertension. My father's or my mother had hypertension or my dad had hypertension. It therefore means I, as a person, might also have this hypertension because it is inherited from parents to children. So with this knowledge of the presence of this kind of trait, disease in my family or in my family generation, I should be able to modify my lifestyle. I should adjust the way I am living in order to prevent this kind of disease or in order to manage this kind of disease, which I already know it's present in my family. So I will modify my lifestyle and also take measures, preventive measures against such disease. Some of these diseases are diseases you can avoid or you can escape from if you live a healthy lifestyle. So with this knowledge, I will check myself and ensure I don't do those things that will make me come down with such disease conditions. So this knowledge is very important to manage or prevent such diseases that are inherited from family generations. The knowledge of family trait will also help me understand and help you understand why we have a particular kind of look or why we act in a particular way. For example, I say some people speak like their mom, speak like their dad, they speak like their grandparents, or maybe the way they carry their body, you will tell that this person just behaves like his dad or like his mom and so on. A good knowledge or a knowledge of family traits or the traits that are common in your family will help you understand better who you look like. Maybe you can tell that I look like my dad. I've always said I look like my dad. You can tell, oh, this no wonder I always do this. It's because I inherited this thing from my mom, my dad, my uncle, or auntie. It will also help us identify unhealthy traits. We are not talking about disease conditions right now. We said some attitudes, some characters can be inherited from parents. So we have unhealthy characters such as bad temper, people that get angry, they get so furious. Every little thing makes them angry. You can also inherit some of these things. But if you understand you inherited this kind of gene, it will help you to manage it better. Aggressiveness, tendency to give up easily, and so on. They are very common amongst some families. So people inherit this kind of trait from their families. If you have a good knowledge of these traits that are present in your family, it will help you take corrective measures against them. We can see a case where a baby inherited this bad or unhealthy trait from his father. You can see him screaming at the top of his voice just like his father. So it will be good for this child to find ways to manage this kind of situation. A knowledge of family traits will help members of a family appreciate and build on the positive traits that are common amongst them. Some people have inherited very good traits from their parents. Some people inherited the trait for kindness from their parents. Some persons inherited the trait for good singing, or maybe something so unique and special. Some persons are sociable like their mom or like their dad, and so on. This kind of trait, if you have an understanding that you inherited it from your parents, you will find ways to maximize them and appreciate them. You build on your kindness, you build on your sociable character to become a better person. Knowledge of family traits will also help us to predict what the future of our children will be like, or maybe what our children will be like in the future. For example, I've not had a child. If I want to get married today and I see my husband, if he's fair, I could say, oh, maybe I'll have a dark child, or maybe I'll have a fair child, or maybe I'll have a child that is not so dark or not so fair. If he's tall, I could say, maybe I'll have a tall child because I have an understanding of the traits that exist in my family. I could also say, maybe I'll have a short child because maybe my other siblings are short or my parents are short. So with this knowledge, we can guess if our children will be as intelligent, tall, dark, thin, as beautiful, or as handsome as we are. All of these traits we can guess because of the knowledge we have about family traits. You can see a case where a man and a woman who are planning to get married, one of them is already trying to imagine what their child would be like. You can see that this child looks so much like the combination of the man and the woman. You can also see that in this case, this mother has a dark skin or a daughter with a dark skin complexion. It is possible for this lady, when she grows up, she could get married and give birth to a child with a light skin complexion. So the knowledge of family traits will help us know and predict all of these things. Lastly, the knowledge of family traits will help us trace our family lineage. We can go back into our genealogy, we can learn about our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so on. We can look at those traits that have been passed on from one generation to another. So when we learn about our forefathers and our parents, our ancestors in the past, so this knowledge will help us learn about all of these things. We can discover those traits that were skipped in some generations and those that were always present. The last part of our class today is tracing our family genealogy. So we call this family genealogy. We want to trace our family lineage. You may not be able to do so much about this, but just in case you're interested, you might want to go back to trace some of these traits that were present in the past generations of your family. So you want to learn how to trace the family traits. It is very, very easy. You might require or need the help of your aunties and uncles, your parents, or older members of your family to provide certain information. Before we begin to look at this, I'd like you to decide on 3 traits that you may want to learn about, maybe 3 or 4. You could take up to 5. Let's say the color, complexion of the skin, color of the eyes, the shape of the earlobe. You can also take the color of the hair of members of your family, and maybe you should add the 5th one. So decide on the traits that you want to learn about in your family. Now, if you've done this, you take the next step to draw a tree. So you draw your family tree beginning from the oldest member of your family that is still alive. You might also want to take the oldest member that is dead if you have people to provide you with information. But in case you don't have, you could just deal with the people you can see. So you could fill in all of these traits yourself. So maybe you start from your great-grandfather or grandmother and your grandparents and so on. Remember, you're taking them from both sides, or you may want to take from one side. Let's look at this family tree. This person decided to start with his grandparents. Maybe these are the oldest members of his family alive. So he took the first generation, which is the generation of his parents, and this is his own generation. They are the grandchildren. So maybe try to draw your tree in that manner, your family tree in that manner. Remember to put down their names. For example, if these are your grandparents from your father's side, you can write her name and his name. You should have their pictures also attach them to make your tree look beautiful. You can put the names of your parents, say your mom, your dad, her brother, his brother, and so on, which are the children of your grandparents. So write down the names. Make a list. We have done that. Make a list of all the traits you want to investigate. That was where we started from. Now begin from the oldest member of your family to pick these traits one at a time. Pick the traits and write them down. So we have a tree. We have the sketch of the tree, as we can see. These are the grandparents. Say this is Mr. or this is Mrs. Rose. She's Rose, and this is Mr. John, the father. Now you can take the first trait. Let's assume the first trait is the color of the skin. She is light in complexion and he is dark. So you just write light and dark for grandmom and granddad from maybe your mom's side. You write for skin complexion fair, skin complexion dark. You could ask your uncles or your aunties to provide some of this information, or your parents to help you with some of this information. Hair color, we can see she has yellow hair color. That's if there's anything like that. And he has red hair color. After doing all of this for each member of your family tree, you have done that. You do for your uncles, your aunties, you do for your parents, you do for your siblings, and for yourself as well. At the end of the day, you would have had an extensive family tree that shows the different traits that have been coming down from various generations in your family. So maybe by the time you get to yourself, you realize that, oh, I have brown hair color. Those are the same hair color that my granddad had. Or I had red hair color. Those are the same hair color that my grandmom had. Because you've done an extensive family tree. I encourage you to do that. Get a sheet of paper and begin to do or draw your family tree in order to trace your family traits. At the end of this exercise, you would have been able to identify traits that were successfully transferred from one generation to the other in your family. You will also find out those traits that have skipped several generations or that skipped generations in your family. We can see something like this. In this case, this red hair color has skipped this generation. That is what the knowledge of family traits will help you achieve. In summary, in today's class, we said the knowledge of how traits are inherited came from the works of a scientist called Gregor Mendel. We said he came about this knowledge through his works on genetics, and genetics is the study of how traits are passed on from parents to children or from parents to offspring, whether parents of plants or parents of humans, animals, or so on. Gregor Mendel performed most of his experiments using pea plants. He did most of his experiments on peas. I hope you can still remember his experiments. Now, the knowledge of traits, family traits, is very important, as we said, and it is important for us to know our family trait because it makes us appreciate who we are, appreciate the way we look, or why we act in a certain way. It helps us to build on our strengths, build on those positive traits that are shared amongst us. It will also help us to prevent diseases and better manage certain diseases, and we can use this knowledge to predict the future of our children. And lastly, we can use this knowledge to trace our family lineage. Before we end today's class, I'd like us to take this question. Which one of the following is part of the 7 traits observed by Gregor Mendel in his pea plants? A, we have the shape of the stem. B, the height of the stem. And C, the color of the stem. If you remember those 7 traits, the correct answer here is the height of the stem. We had short stems or tall stems. So we had a short pea plant or tall pea plants. The second question, which one of the following is not correct? A, tracing our family traits will help us avoid or better manage certain health conditions in our family. B, tracing our family traits will help us identify traits that have skipped some generations in our family tree. C, tracing our family traits will help us learn how to change our looks. The correct answer here is option C. The other options are correct about family traits and about tracing our family traits, except option C. We have come to the end of our lesson on family traits. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned so much. I also hope to see you in our next class. Until then, thank you for staying in this class.